Howdy, howdy, and thanks for checking out episode 130 of the Eyes Free Sports podcast. My name is Greg Lindberg. Here on this episode, we are chatting with a gentleman from the great state of California. And in addition to being a longtime adaptive endurance athlete, he has also launched a very successful online database that helps connect blind and visually impaired runners and walkers and guides. So why don't we go ahead and hit the track and start running toward episode 130 of the Eyes Free Sports podcast. All right, so here on this episode of Eyes Free Sports, I'm excited to introduce Rich Hunter. And Rich is a longtime adaptive athlete and also the founder of United in Stride. Rich, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we're finally connecting. I know, before we started, I told you I've heard so much about you from many of my guests and your program and the amazing connections they've made, with guides and whatnot. So great to finally meet you here and get into it.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm flattered that you're hearing from people that are benefiting from United in Stride.
Absolutely. And I personally registered not too long ago myself, so I'm looking to get back on the site here soon and make some connections too.
And we need more people down there in Florida where you're at. So would love to be able to grow, especially in the Orlando area where we have a lot of people who like going to Orlando to visit the Disney parks and Universal Studios. So it's a great vacation destination spot for everybody. And some of us like to be able to run or do fitness walking or hiking when we're on the road. So I'm glad you signed up.
Absolutely, for sure. So why don't we just kick things off here, Rich, just with your background as far as your early years and kind of your childhood, if you just want to start from the beginning.
So I grew up in northeastern Oregon in a town called Pendleton. And a lot of people know about Pendleton because of Pendleton wool. It's also a rodeo town, and which I had no part of, but just grew up there, graduated from high school in northeastern Oregon, and met my wife at Oregon State University, where we both attended. And I was part of the Navy ROTC program there, and we were introduced by some mutual friends because she was a good student and she had enlisted in the Marines out of high school. And so she had to take a little break from college to go to boot camp and then come back to college. So they thought we'd have some things in common.
Right. Interesting. And then before we get into your military journey, as far as your visual impairment, just talk to me about your vision journey.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa when I was a second lieutenant in the Marines. And so, which was a devastating blow because I wanted to serve our country. And my career choice was to be in the military. I have a long history of my family on both sides serving in the military. And so when I was back in Quantico, Virginia at the basic school after college, in a routine eye exam, they noticed an abnormality in my retina. And so they sent me on for additional medical appointments. And I got the news that I had this eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa and that I was going to go blind and it wasn't compatible with military service. And I was absolutely stunned. At the time, it was like a death sentence because it meant obviously vision loss, and it meant the end of my military journey. And so it was very, very challenging time. On top of that, I didn't know anybody with vision loss. And even though retinitis pigmentosa is a hereditary eye condition, nobody in my family was visually impaired or blind. I was the first one. So that was a huge shocker.
Sure. So how many years did you end up serving?
I was in less than a year. It felt a lot longer than that because wow. I was 4 years Navy ROTC at Oregon State, and there's all these, and it's very all-consuming when you're in a program like we had at Oregon State, and you had military training in the summers, and you pretty much lived at the Navy ROTC unit and had lots of leadership obligations, and so it felt a lot longer. But even though I was in for under a year, because soon as I was diagnosed with my eye condition, the doctor said, Richard, if you had 19 years of service and you were diagnosed with this eye condition, you would still get medically discharged. And I was just shocked by that. I appealed to try to stay in the military, and I had a JAG officer trying to help me with the appeals. And, usually the government moves very slow, and it was shocking how fast they wanted to process me out.
Wow. Mm. And so was it kind of your original goal to have a long-term career, serving a lifelong kind of career in the military?
Well, my grandfather served 20 years in the Navy, and he was a World War II submariner. And so I don't know how long I would have stayed in, but I was so excited about the idea of being a leader of men in the military, and so it was a heartbreak. It took me about a year before I could even start thinking about what's next in my life at that time. So it was definitely my first kind of big setback, because everything I'd done up to that point was to be able to get a scholarship so I could afford to go to college. So when I was in high school, I worked really hard, and I was a valedictorian in my class, which allowed me to get a scholarship, and then did quite well in college. So I was primed to to start a great career, but I guess that wasn't ended up not being the big plan.
Right. You never know. Curveballs come our way, and just got to make the best of it. Right.
Well, and I think that's part of what you've probably heard from a lot of people with vision loss is adapting to curveballs, and making changes, and being flexible and finding ways to solve problems. So I guess that was just the primer for what was to come.
That's right. Yeah, kind of preparing you maybe unexpectedly for the future. So obviously you were in your early 20s at the time. So what was kind of your next step after that?
Well, I since I came from Oregon, I had no plans on going back to Oregon, and I was dating who is my wife right now at the time, and so her family lived outside of Sacramento in Folsom, and so when she graduated from college, she moved to California. So when I was discharged from the Marines, I just decided, well, I'm going to see if I'm going to try to make a go of this in California. And so I moved nearby so that I could at least continue to have a relationship with my now wife, Heidi. So just moved out to California.
Nice. And is she fully sighted? Or?
Yeah, she is.
Gotcha. How did you end up twisting her arm to stick with you?
Well, fortunate, my wife, I've just been really blessed because my wife is just one of these people that has a can-do attitude. And, when she found out about my prognosis and the eye condition, it didn't faze her at all. And, which has really been a blessing to me we've been married since 1991. So I was, all this stuff happened. I graduated from college in 1989. I was discharged in 1990, married in 1991. So through all the trials and tribulations and changes and whatnot in my vision loss journey, I've just been really blessed that I've have a wonderful wife, and now have three adult daughters, two of which are married, and so I'm just surrounded by a great support system and just wonderful people. And coincidentally, my wife, she was in the Marine Corps Reserves. And when Gulf War I started, coincidentally, the strangest thing was she started losing vision in part of one of her eyes, and it happened very
Hmm.
quickly. And so she lost a quarter of a vision in her left eye, and it ended up being some inflammation on her optic nerve. And what was initially kind of a scary thing, like, oh, could this be a brain tumor? Could this be multiple sclerosis? It ended up being as a result of toxoplasmosis, which is something that you can get by digging in the dirt or changing kitty litter, but it affected her optic nerve, and she ended up being discharged from the Marines also, from the Marine Corps Reserves, because of her vision loss in her left eye. So another thing we shared in
Wow.
common.
Sure, sure. Definitely a lot of irony there.
Mm-hmm.
So then in terms of your civilian career, just talk to me about any career highlights kind of early on you'd like to mention.
Yeah. So I was able to, like I said, it took me about a year before I could start thinking long term again. The I'm such a goal driven person, and having the carpet kind of torn out from underneath my feet, it took me a while just like think what's next. And so I had set my eyes on being a school psychologist. So I paid my dues. I ran like group homes for kids with emotional problems for several years, so I could pay my dues to get into graduate school. And then I ended up working as a school psychologist in a small rural school district in Northern California for 10 years, and taught part time at California State University, Sacramento, in the graduate program of school psychology, which ended up being quite fortuitous because even though at this point I met one other blind, I had an eye diagnosis, but no need for any type of accommodations. I could drive. It was just this diagnosis at the time where once a year I'd go to my retinal specialist, and they would remind me that I have this eye condition, and they'd be tracking the progress, and I'd give myself permission to feel sorry for myself for a day or two, and then I would just bury my head in the sand and think I'd be fine, and nothing was gonna go wrong. But and so here I was a school psychologist in the school district, and the job of the school psychologist is to assess students for special education services, identifying school-based disabilities like learning disabilities, and the whole spectrum of different type of disabilities could impact a kid in the public school system, and then help be part of the team that designs an educational program for them. And even during that whole time, I met one blind student and that was when I was an intern on his way to the California School for the Blind. So even up through all that time, those 10 years as a school psychologist, I still knew nothing about blindness. And it wasn't until the I had a rapid rate of vision loss in 2004, 2005, 20 years ago, a real rapid rate of vision loss where every time I went to the eye doctor, um, my vision got worse, 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 worse. And I lost the ability to drive. And then it's like I was having, and the Department of Rehabilitation came out to help figure out some accommodations at work. And it wasn't until that time that I even knew about all these different tools that were available to blind people, even though I was in this field of disabilities. And it literally brought tears to my eyes. The magnification tools at the time that allowed me to stay in my job longer in that role. And then I also, learned about blindness rehabilitation stuff, and learned a little bit of Braille, which I've since forgotten. White cane travel, using a computer as a visually impaired person. But that was kind of the early introduction to, I had this background in disabilities and in empathy and connections in this disabled community among, out in the county where I worked. But still no connection to the blind other than my own situation, which I think is significant in thinking about it because I've always felt like everything I've ever done, I've had to trailblaze my own path forward. So not knowing anybody who's blind and not having any type of reference point about what was possible, and just happened to figure it out that um, I just when I did finally start meeting other people with vision loss, I just felt how empowering that was to be part of the community and in meeting other people who were successful and who were living full lives. Um, so and the importance of just not being out there on your own, which really ties into a lot of the probably my motivations later on for helping other people.
Right, right. That's a really interesting insight. I think it's a great example. If you're not connected, if you don't have any kind of, like you said, reference point, it can feel isolating and just a lack of knowledge too. A lot of ignorance about what is out there, in terms of services, and obviously the focus of my podcast, sports, recreation, just so many opportunities.
Absolutely.
So yeah, then transitioning on to sports and rec. So I am curious, just rewinding a little bit back to your childhood. Did you play sports? Were you pretty active growing up as a kiddo?
Yes, but the reality is that when I was young, I hated running. I mean, the worst day ever at school was the 1 mile run, and it was a day that I dreaded. I mean, running was this. I felt like was a punishment. In fact, I was a football player. I'm a big guy. I'm six. In high school, I was 6'1" and 115 pounds, and I was a lineman. And when you got in trouble, then there was this tree that was a couple hundred yards away, and you would have to run up this hill and run around this tree and come back. So running was always a punishment.
Right.
It wasn't until I was in ROTC where you actually had to run 3 miles for a time, and you were constantly being tested 3 miles, where I started to develop an interest in running, and that like I actually for a big guy, I found that I was faster than a lot of people.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely not always the case. And then so in terms of kind of sports for the blind, adaptive sports, what was kind of your initial, introduction and then recognition that such programs, such activities existed?
When I left my job as a school psychologist, I had daughters, and I had this strong conviction that I had to model for my children that you can still be relevant and set ambitious goals in the face of adversity. And I had to assess, like, what is it that I enjoy doing? What are the things that I'm good at? And I'm like, well, I could set an ambitious goal in running. Could I qualify for the Boston Marathon? And at the time, I didn't know anything about that there was a visually impaired category. All I saw was this, the age group standards for someone my age at the time, which was a 3-hour, 20-minute marathon. And then doing this research, I found out that there was this visually impaired division of the Boston Marathon. So all this stuff has happened simultaneously. And so my local marathon here in Sacramento is the California International Marathon. It's regarded as the number one marathon besides the Boston Marathon to qualify for Boston. A lot of Boston qualifiers in Sacramento. And so I sent this impulsive email to the race director at the time, and I hadn't even signed up for the marathon. I was just thinking, can I qualify for Boston? I said, hey, the Boston Marathon, CIM boasts for being this top qualifier of the Boston Marathon. The Boston Marathon has this visually impaired division. Have you ever thought about adding a visually impaired division? Now, this was in the spring of 2007. I didn't really expect to get a response. And I got a response fairly quickly from the race director, and they said, I think this is a great idea. Let's do it this year. And I said, that's great. And I'm actually secretly just like kind of terrified. And I said, I will help you network to grow the division. What they did not know at the time, literally in 2007, I did not know a single visually impaired or blind athlete, not one, nobody. And so I had put my neck out here and said, I will help you grow this division. But not only that, I was going to have to run a marathon that year. I was thinking maybe the next year I'd try this. I thought it might take me a while to do all this. And, I contacted the Society for the Blind, where I'd received some blindness rehabilitation training. And I called the executive director, and I asked him, "Hey, do you know any blind runners?" And he says, "No, I don't know anybody." And he said, "But we have someone on our board of directors, and he was a Paralympian in skiing. His name's Mike May. So
definitely heard the name.
Why don't you talk to Mike May?" So I got introduced to Mike May, who ends up being this like real famous blind guy. And I didn't even know it at the time. And I called Mike and I said, "Mike, do you know any blind runners?" And he was like, "No, I don't know any blind runners." And in fact, it was funny because Mike even says, "Well, why do you need a visually impaired division? Why can't you just run it?" And I explained my rationale. It made sense to Mike. But he's one of these people that just lives this full immersed life in the visual world. And he's, just, has all these skills. He's just super competent and sets the bar really high sort of guy. So I understood where it was coming from. But he did tell me about this organization, the U.S. Association of Blind Athletes. And that led to me being introduced to my first ever visually impaired runner. His name is Kurt. At the time, he lived in Omaha, Nebraska. And it just so happened that he was the fastest visually impaired runner at that time competing in the United States. And Kurt came out to run the California International Marathon that year. So it wasn't just me. There were two of us, and I got second place.
Wow.
And Kurt, super fast guy, he said, "Hey," because I qualified for the Boston Marathon, which was just shocking to me that I was able to do that. I finished in 3 hours and 18 minutes. Again, it's like 6'1", at that time, I think like 225 pounds. I run this 3:18 marathon, and he invited me out to be part of the Team with a Vision with the Massachusetts Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired. And that experience right there just blew me away. It was because they provide all these VIP services. They're picking me up at the airport. There's dinners. I'm meeting other visually impaired athletes. They made this, for the first time ever, I ran with guides. And it was just so amazing. And it made such a tremendous impact on me that I thought, okay, I want to do something to help our community. It was just super, super empowering.
Wow. Amazing. And so I assume that's kind of the genesis of United in Stride, right?
Yeah. And after that, I just continued because I made that promise to the California International Marathon. Just to make a long story short, I ended up branding the California International Marathon. For 13 years, I coordinated the Marathon National Championships for the visually impaired. And so, starting out with Kurt and I back in 2007, over the next 13 years, I ended up, routinely having 50 visually impaired, or in the neighborhood of 50 visually impaired runners, 75 sighted guides. In the dinner, instead of Kurt and I having a sandwich for lunch after picking up a race packet, I'd be hosting 175 to 180 people at a banquet and having all these weekend events and bringing people together from the blind community and just seeing the huge impact that it had on these people, not just the visually impaired people, but the guides. And one of the things that I found, once I started running these marathons is, I'd wear a vest that says blind on it. Always have, since, to just make myself more visible when I used to run by myself when I had more vision. But people that were out there on the course, they would see me, and then they'd see a guide and like, "Oh my gosh, this is great. How do we get involved? How can we get involved in guiding?" And I would say, "Well, how good is your memory?" And I would literally try to give them strategies to remember my email address as I'm running a marathon. or you can call the race director. They know who I am, and they can put you in touch with me later. And at the time, if you didn't know me or a handful of other people in the country, there was just no way to become part of a community of people. There's really no way to get involved in guiding unless you lived in a big city where they had an active Achilles chapter, which, there's a lot of the country that doesn't have an Achilles chapter. Most cities don't have an Achilles chapter.
Right.
So you really needed to know a handful of us so you could network, because we had our own personal databases that we kept, from cities around the country, so we could introduce people. And so I'm like, okay, well, we've got to fix this. And so that's why I came with up with the idea of United in Stride. And it's also the reason why United in Stride, instead of forming my own not-for-profit, because I could have done that, but I was also a big believer that there were already organizations out there that were doing really good jobs of helping the blind community. And instead of creating another not-for-profit that might struggle, it's like, why not lift up and support the not-for-profits that already exist? And I had this amazing experience with MABV in the Boston area, and they had a long history of helping the blind community, especially with running through the Boston Marathon, that I'd approached MABV about my idea with United in Stride so that they would own it, so I wouldn't have to start my own not-for-profit. So United in Stride is, while I founded it, and my family, we named it. My family, my wife and I funded it initially. The initial development of the website and all that. It is a program of the Massachusetts Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and it continues to be. And so now, instead of having to know a few of us in the country, now we have this resource that uses a zip code find a partner function so that anybody can create a profile. And if you have a profile, you can just enter a zip code, a mile radius. You're looking for a guide, and we have some additional filters, and you can do a search and it'll populate a list, and you can message them through the system. So both visually impaired people and guides can find one another for fitness, walking, jogging, and running. So now you don't have to know me, which I absolutely love, because my goal is to make myself obsolete, because people shouldn't have to know me or others to be able to network and find guides. They should just be able to do that independently. And this is a tool that helps them do that. So it will outlive me.
Right. Very cool. And I'm definitely curious, just in terms of like any statistics you have on the number of members or anything you're willing to share about like where maybe the biggest regions are for runners and guides on the site.
I think that we have in the neighborhood of 5,000, and it was intentionally built as a resource for both the United States and Canada. And my belief is that that there's visually impaired and blind people in every community across the United States, and that there's people that would get outdoors and get engaged in outdoor fitness, walking, jogging, running, or whatever, if they knew it was possible and if they had the resources to do it. So United in Stride we have members in little tiny towns where, we have blind people that may live in a small town and there's no guides around them because of where they're at. And then we have other cities where there's hundreds of members in a given city. We actually launched a new website in January. It was very expensive, but it was there was a big need to make it more efficient, more accessible, more reliable, add some additional features to enable text notifications, all this stuff in January. And so we are systematically going through some of these larger communities where we have a lot of members to get them to update their profiles in these bigger cities and to ensure that people who because we have all these people that want a guide. When they created a profile, they heard about United Stride, they want a guide. We want to try to get these people involved in helping our visually impaired community as much as possible. And so we're going through various cities, like let's say Boston, for example, where we have like couple ambassadors in Boston, Massachusetts, and if somebody has an old profile and they haven't been active, we're actually also in the process of cleaning out profiles. So we're deleting profiles as we speak, but we're growing faster than we're deleting. So that's a good thing, because we just want the system to work and we want it to help people.
Right. Very interesting. And I'm also curious, would you say, as far as the ratio, are there more blind and visually impaired members or guides, or is it about even?
There's definitely more guides in the system, which is needed. Like I've had, like up in the Seattle, for example, we have an ambassador in the Seattle area, and she just mentioned, Richard, there's probably 6 to 8 times more guides than there are visually impaired people. And I'm like, well, that's perfect, because each visually impaired person needs at least 6 to 8 different partners minimum, so they could get out on a regular basis. So we need more guides. The most guides I've ever ran with in a year has been 50 guides.
Wow.
There's a year where I ran, the most miles I've ever ran in a year has been 2,056 miles. I did not run a single mile on a treadmill, not one. 2,056 miles. And even when and that includes being on the road, traveling. So I'd visit cities and I'd network in advance, and I would find guides, whether I was in Amish country or New York City or Philadelphia or Orlando or Hawaii. San Diego, it didn't matter where I was traveling. I could use United and Stride to help me network, to find someone to run with when I'm traveling.
Sure. And I assume people tend to be pretty responsive in terms of, if you're looking to run within, say, the week or even within a few days. Would you say the guys are pretty available?
What I recommend is so I just recently was in both. I went from Scottsdale to Oahu. And so I usually would send a message out, like if I'm on the road, what I recommend other people do is they would, do a search a couple weeks in advance and try to network. And like in the case of Oahu, for example, I messaged several people. I heard back from a few, and they were all gone. They were on vacation. But I don't stop there. So one of the guides that was responded like, "Oh, I'm out of town. It's too bad you're not here." I'm like, "Well, do you have any friends who run?" And this is all through our United Stride messaging portal. And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "I happen to work at Hawaii Pacific University." He was an athletic trainer, and he put me in touch with his cross-country coach. And so I was clear out at Disney Alani, and this cross-country coach brought out a couple of his runners, drove 30 minutes out to go run with me for 6 miles. But it was, so it's just this, even though the United and Stride member wasn't available, they still helped me network to find someone to run with when I was in Oahu, which led to some other connections as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just the connections I'm sure a lot of the guides have within their local running communities and groups. And like you said, even if they're not necessarily available, there's a good chance they can find someone that can probably help, or even, kind of go down the line like telephone.
Well, in the case of Oahu, this is what's so awesome about networking, is there's also the same person that helped me connect with Hawaii Pacific University runners also put the word out. And so this one guy who was an experienced guide, not on United and Stride, also volunteered to run with me. So he came out on a different day and ran 6 miles with me. Well, I'm like, well, who's the blind person that you're running with? Well, so he introduced me to her, and she lived in Honolulu, and she had started a not-for-profit in Honolulu, and she's starting a running and walking group in the new year. And so she joined United Stride, her guy joined United Stride. She's connecting with other people from United and Stride to fold into her walking and running group. So just by me doing a little bit of networking, it ends up having a snowball effect where we can get even more people involved on a more regular basis in a given city.
Exactly. Yeah. And it sounds like you're definitely quite a traveler and you're getting out there just in general, but also as far as outreach and making those connections too.
But it doesn't have to be just me. That's the great thing about this, because United in Stride is a networking tool. It's for different blindness organizations to use. It's a resource for all. So anybody traveling can do exactly what I just did and have the exact same outcomes and meet some great people and make some great connections, because ultimately every guide visually impaired connection is two lives transformed. And
True.
I believe with my full being based on experience, not only that, but the guide visually impaired connection literally saves lives.
Mm.
I've been doing this for a long time, and I've heard more than a few stories of where people experiencing vision loss, feeling isolated, feeling depressed. So unfortunately, there's people on that suicide bubble at some point, and it's human connection and community that can be the thing that makes all the difference in the world. And it's not what I'm doing. It's, the platform helps make these relationships possible, but it's the guides and the visually impaired people and that connection, and also the opportunity for people to come together in community where they have this community, these community opportunities. So, and that like experience in hearing firsthand the impact and the stories that people have, it just really fuels my motivation to just pour more and more time into what I'm doing, because I just know that people's lives are being transformed, both the guides and the visually impaired people, both two lives transformed. And I've heard of, and I keep on hearing of new stories where I thought two lives are being transformed, and then I see this ripple effect, this spider web of impact, and how that plays out in the lives of the family members of the visually impaired person or other choices that they make. It even has a broader effect, just that guide visually impaired connection. So if United in Stride has more guides than visually impaired people, that's great. And those are all transformed lives.
Absolutely. Very well said. That's powerful stuff. Appreciate you sharing that, Rich. Just a couple other questions before we wrap up here. In terms of tethers, I'm definitely curious your take on the most effective tethers when it comes to either running or swimming in your experience.
So one of what I personally use, and then United in Stride, we even have a link on our website under our resources. Is I use an 18-inch handheld tether with loops on either end. Stunt Puppy actually makes them for us, and it's this webby material. And but I just put two fingers in my side, my guides on my right, and he puts two fingers in his, and so that way they can. When they're giving verbal commands, and if they say go left, but they're going right, I don't get too far away from them. So I prefer a handheld tether. There are some runners that prefer a waist tether. There's a lot of triathletes who use a waist tether around each of their waists. It's not something I personally prefer. And there's also some blind people that prefer a rigid tether. I know one guy, for example, this is a little bit more extreme, that he actually runs behind his guide and they hold on to like the equivalent of like PVC pipe. And they're like locomotive fashion, like a train. So he's in between those two things, that two poles, and his guide's in front. They're chugging along so that he can stay within those boundaries. And then there's some people that will hold like the equivalent of like a collapsible white cane in their hands. Like I have a flexible, like webbing material, short tether that's, loose and looser kind of material, obviously. And there's some people that want to hold on to something rigid, like a collapsible white cane. So they feel even more connected because it's a rigid thing. They don't have that floppy component, and that makes them feel a little bit safer. So there are some rules at the Paralympics level, and like if you're on the Boston Marathon in the competitive division, they actually have very specific tethers they have to use that are an exact length. But the tethers that we have on United and Stride do the trick for a lot of people.
Interesting. Yeah, and I'm sure it's a very subjective thing, and like you said, some things work better for certain folks than others.
Yeah, and some people so sometimes what'll happen is, like, for example, there will be a brand new visually impaired runner. They've never ran with a guide before. And they don't even know how to give instructions to their guide, like even tell them what their guiding preferences are. So they're familiar with maybe sighted guide. So, your blind audience knows what sighted guide is. Not, we use this same terminology for different things, but like holding on to someone's elbow is like walking through a crowded space or something. So they're familiar with that, and they're very comfortable, like holding on to someone's elbow, right? So getting someone wants to be a runner from the comfort level of a physical connection to somebody to holding on to an 18-inch like webbing tether, even that level of freedom is a little bit unnerving for people until they can build up, the trust with their guide. So we have a guide tutorial video on the homepage of United and Stride with descriptive narration. It's 5 minutes long, and it's being used all over the world. That gives people a starting place so that they can learn about, the type of language that we use for guiding, and if they meet a person that's willing to guide them, they have a good starting place. Since I'm pretty well connected where I live here in Sacramento and I love helping people, I will reach out to experienced guides and I will say, hey, can you go down? This is a brand new blind runner. They've never ran with a guide before. Could you run with them a time or two just so that they can learn what their preference is to be guided? So that way they can then, when they meet other guides, they can tell them what to do and they can teach them, because it's basically, as a blind person, it's my responsibility to let the guide know how to guide me, right? That's my responsibility as a blind person.
Sure. Just in general too, advocating for ourselves, speaking up, whatever needs we might have, because people just in general, they're uncomfortable. They might not know how to help us just out and about in our daily lives. So that's a great point.
One of the things that I think is a really important thing to note is for especially for your audience, is that blind people, I've found, unfortunately, they think it's a burden to ask someone to guide them. That's a barrier in our community. They think they're a burden. They think that it's like, boy, I have to ask for help. And I'm here to tell the listeners, these people that are signing up to be guides, they would argue over and over and over again that they're getting more out of it than the blind athlete, because they're giving back. They're sharing the sport they love with someone who wouldn't otherwise be able to participate. They want to help. It is not a burden. And you can take the most accomplished blind athletes that you can even think of, and they have all used sighted guides. Eric Weinmeier never would have made it to the top of Mount Everest for the first time if he didn't have guides that were willing to help him prepare and to be his eyes during that journey. So you can list whether it's Paralympic skiers, Paralympians. I mean, even the most accomplished blind people benefit from having guides so that we can get out there and enjoy things just like everyone else. Guides remove our disability. If you are running on a paved surface, like by my house, I'm running on bike paths, and it's not rocky terrain, if I'm running with a guide, I am not disabled because they remove that disability because they're telling me when to pick up my feet. And the people that I run with become my friends. In the beginning, they're a little bit nervous and they want to help. After I've ran with them a few times, they end up becoming my friends. If I ever stop running, I'm going to have to find a way to make new friends because my whole friend network, for the most part, are people that started as my guides. Well, I can tell you that guides have helped me get to the start line and the finish line because I have to prepare properly to do the things I do. 30 marathons, which include all 6 world major marathons, so other countries, obviously, and Ironman, triathlon, and a 100-mile endurance run in all the races, in between that, 50 milers and stuff like that. All that was done with the assistance of guides. I could not have done that alone. And I'm forever grateful. And their service to me fuels a passion in me to pay it forward because, like them, they're giving and I'm receiving as a runner. But I can pay it forward because I can give too. And so that's why I do all the things that I do. And I spend 80 to 100 hours a month volunteering to help our community and help people connect and network, not just on my own behalf, but on behalf of the others as well.
Sure, absolutely. I know you have mentioned some, specific keys just in terms of what makes a good partnership with the blind runner and their guide. Anything else you'd like to mention on that front?
Guiding is not rocket science, and I can train any guide to feel comfortable guiding me, and I have very little vision left. It's not very helpful. I can't see the ground within 3 miles where they feel very comfortable. And so it's easy for me because of my experience to have a level of trust very quickly with guides myself. What I feel like from the community of blind people is that we also have to do things to build trust with them. So, like, I always want just small little gestures, So, for example, when I always confirm with my guides on the weekend, I have my guides lined up for the week, even if I run with them every single week, some of them, I'll send out a message, just confirming our Wednesday 6:15 a.m. run. Thumbs up. When they get here, I'm ready 100% of the time. I'm out there, I'm in my driveway. When they arrive, they don't have to knock on my door. I'm ready to go. My shoes are on, and they can trust that. And they know exactly what my plan is, and we implement our plan. And I'm also very encouraging to my guides. I'm not critical of my guides. Guides cannot be perfect. And so I just want to make sure that they're having a very positive experience when they're guiding me, and I treat them with a great deal of respect 100% of the time. So I think that's how we build trust with our guides. And then we develop trust with our guides because they're showing up when they say they're going to show up, but also that they're giving us the type of verbal cues that we need so that we're getting the feedback we need to be safe. And, that builds up over time as well.
Sure. The communication aspect I know is just such an important key. And yeah, really like what you said too about kind of that making a good first impression. Almost reminds me of like a first date, that first job interview. You want to put yourself out there in the best possible light, in any kind of relationship or connection that you might be making. And it definitely applies to this situation as well.
Well, and it's not just like the first date experience in that, because to build up trust, it's like week after week after week. We're consistent. We're reliable. We use good communication, and then because then they'll want to continue to guide. And when they move somewhere else, they want to stay involved in guiding because they've had a positive experience with me or others. They want to remain part of our community.
That's right. And making a long-term connection obviously is ideal instead of having to juggle through multiple guides. I mean, obviously in some cases that's going to happen, but finding those, like you said, building that trust, that relationship, and being able to stick with them, I'm sure is a big help.
One of the big tips that I do want to give to people who are looking for guides is because I know how to do this, and I would say I'm an expert at recruiting guides. And even though I've ran with a lot of guides, I'm always recruiting new guides. Is that when people are reaching out to find new guides, what they have to say is, I'm looking for people who are willing to guide me once or twice a month. That's what they say. I've seen too many times that people in our community, they will send out, it's not very good communication, not very clear. They'll say, oh, will you be my guide? Literally, people say that. They send a message to someone, will you be my guide? Well, that person's not going to really get a good response because like, oh, I have kids, I have a job. There's all these things running there through their head because I have my own goals. What we need are 6 to 8 guides minimum that are willing to help with us once or twice a month. Some of those guides will decide they like it and they're available once a week. Some every couple of weeks. I have several guides run with me every 2 weeks. Some once a month and some less. But that one guide who's an ultra runner that could run that 20-mile run with me on a Saturday 2 months from now, that person's equally as important in my training plan. So we need, right. we have to work towards finding a lot of resources, engaging more guides, be willing to recruit guides and train guides all the time.
Right. Okay, so before we put a bow on this episode, if you just want to give the listeners the lowdown on the website and just how they can get involved in United in Stride if they're interested.
Yeah, if you go to www.unitedinstride.com, you can create a profile there. It's very simple. I encourage everybody to also opt into text notifications. We even have a question there about experience level. So if you've never walked, done any fitness, walking, jogging, hiking, or running with a guide before, you're new, and it goes all the way up to advanced if you're comfortable training other people. And the guide similarly can identify whether their experience level, like a self-reported thing. And once you have a profile, you can go over to the Find a Partner function, and you can just, you would click a button. It's very accessible. You're looking for in this case, a guide within your drop-down menu. I always suggest at least 10 miles, if not 20 miles. So you click that box of zip code. You enter your zip code, whether it's your home or a hotel where you're staying. And then there's some pacing information. I now recommend clicking any distance, any pace. And then you can click to connect. And that just opens up a dialog box, and you can, subject line, short message, introducing who you are. Again, looking for someone to run with you once or twice a month or whatever. And you click send. And you can literally, once you send a message, you can go right back to the next person with that populates the list. When you do the Find a Partner search, it populates a list of all the people that in your criteria. Send a message to the next person. And you can send a bunch of messages within 10 minutes. And if people don't hear back from someone within 2 weeks, we encourage them to reach out to us and send us a message, because we can message them outside of the system to make sure they're seeing the messages. About 80% of our database have not updated their profiles since we launched our new features in January. So they may have not opted into text notifications. So now we've made our messaging system more reliable if people edit their profiles to include text notifications. And tell us about your success stories.
All right. Again, our guest on this episode has been Rich Hunter. And Rich, thank you so much for your time. You gave some really interesting insight, a lot of thought-provoking things that you talked about. So really appreciate the time. And also just thank you for everything you're doing with United in Stride and trying to make the world more accessible, more inclusive, and getting people out there walking and running.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Alrighty. To hear more episodes of the Eyes Free Sports podcast and to subscribe, search for Eyes Free Sports on your favorite podcast platform or visit eyesfreesports.com. Be sure to follow the Eyes Free Sports podcast at facebook.com/eyesfreesports and on Twitter at eyesfreesports.